Hi, everyone. We'll give us a minute or two and then we'll dive in. I think we can go ahead and get started with some of the introductions at this point. While a couple of folks might still join us, we'll go ahead and get things started. It is such a pleasure to be here with you all today to discuss how we might increase software innovation in digital health products through unified cross-architecture programming. So excited for this session in particular, not only because it's an excellent opportunity to showcase the thought leadership from my fellow panelists here, but it's also an incredibly technical topic that, as I've learned from my fellow speakers and I've explored the topic further, there's so much potential for us to explore solutions within areas of greatest unmet need. And I think by the end of today, you'll be able to know a little bit more about the topic, see some examples for how this technology is being put to use today, and also start thinking a little bit more about how we might leverage heterogeneous computing and unified cross-architecture programming in order to solve some of the greatest challenges within this space in order to improve innovation, to improve scalability of digital health tools, and to improve access to these technologies over time. So I'll go ahead and I'll take a step back. My name is Sarah Valentine. I'm a partnerships manager here at Dime, and my role is really to ensure that all of the partners we're engaging with across the field are able to make the most out of their experience working and collaborating with Dime. Taking another step back or two, who's Dime in the first place? For those that are less familiar with who we are, the Digital Medicine Society is a global nonprofit that's purpose is really to advance the ethical, effective, equitable, and safe use of digital medicine to redefine healthcare and improve lives. So we really exist at this unique intersection of healthcare and technology. And while we're not tech determinists, we see incredible value and opportunity in being able to leverage some of the latest and greatest in both hardware, software, etc., in order to advance the way that we're caring for patients, whether that's through clinical research, through healthcare, through regulations. And so excited to be here with you today. A couple of additional housekeeping items before we dive too deep into the presentation. Please note that today's session is being recorded, which is great for those that weren't able to join us today. We typically try to post the recording and the slides to our website within a day or so. So for any colleagues who weren't able to make it for today's session, please feel free to share them the link. And finally, for those of you that are able to make it today, you'll have the opportunity to ask your questions live. For those of you that are in an area where you feel comfortable unmuting and asking your question live, we'll ask you to raise your hand using the Zoom functionality. But for others who maybe don't, or if you feel more comfortable doing so, please feel free to type your questions into the chat or the Q&A, and we'll be sure to get to those during today's discussion. All right, I've done a lot of talking, and now comes the exciting part where I get to introduce our fellow panelists for today, Beenish and David. Beenish, I'll go ahead and start with you, if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit more about who you are and the kind of work that you're doing.
Yes. Hey, everyone. This is Beenish Zia. I am an electrical engineer by education and currently serve as the chief architect for medical imaging business at Intel Corporation. I'm very passionate about evolving technology in healthcare field. So it's a great pleasure to be here and be with the rest of you and talk about increasing software innovation in digital health products.
Thank you. And I'll pass it to you, David, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself. And
Yes,
sharing.
good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everybody. As I said, my name is David Blackman, and from a title, I am Executive Director of Digital and Decentralized Clinical Trial Strategy at Oracle. Probably more than 20 plus years experience in technology innovation, and from an education perspective, I have degrees in architecture and computer information systems. I joined Oracle around 2 years ago and came to them from an industry-leading clinical research organization in a corporate strategy and development organization, where I led business innovation and the deployment of some cutting-edge technologies and novel approaches to solve some of the problems that legacy approaches to clinical research were bringing to us, and to some extent are still bringing today. Before that, I spent 10 plus years in big tech in various global leadership roles.
Thank you so much. All right, well, enough of me. I'll go ahead and I'll pass it to our panelists to introduce the topic of unified cross-architecture programming. Vinesh, if you wouldn't mind taking it away.
Sounds good. Thanks, Sarah. So what we wanted to do was kick off the session with a couple of slides just to level set the definition of unified cross-architecture programming and heterogeneous computing. So what I want to start with is that we all know that the different cases, whether it's healthcare or a different industry, the number of use cases are increasing, and that's driving a need of different kind of accelerators to meet the performance requirement as well as the application requirement. And what it's been found that 48% of developers are targeting heterogeneous systems that use more than one kind of processors. So to expand furthermore on heterogeneous computing, what we mean by it is you have a central compute device that sends off tasks to other accelerators. Now, those accelerators could be a central processing unit or a CPU, could be general processing unit or a GPU, could be a field programmable gate array or a FPGA, or any other form of accelerators, could be an ASIC, could be a visual processing unit. So that's what we mean when we talk about a heterogeneous computing. Now, as we build on the slide, you will see that the biggest problem that developers face is programming these different kind of accelerators, because right now there are multiple architectures from different vendors, and each of them, one of them is requiring a different kind of programming model, dependencies on different kind of libraries. So as a developer who's writing an application for the end user, it becomes really challenging to figure out which accelerator you want to use first, and then try to create a programming that is only specific to that accelerator and not be able to port it. And in order to address that exact problem, a unified cross-architecture programming was developed. So the idea of unified cross-architecture programming is that it's open, it's a standard-based, and it's multi-architecture. And what that would mean is, as a developer, you would write your program once and deploy it anywhere without having to think about the underlying hardware. And one of the ways to do that is using one API, which is a one application programming interface and industry specification, to program multiple architectures. So let's go to the next slide and look a little more on what one API is. So as I mentioned, it's an industry initiative. It's not owned by a company. It's completely an industry specification. Different companies are coming up with its own implementation, but when we talk about one API, it's a community-based industry initiative. And if you look at the diagram on the right side, it might look complicated, but the idea is at the lowest level is your hardware. And as a developer, what the aim of one API is, you don't have to think about the hardware. You can think about hardware at a later stage, but you use one API, which runs on Data Parallel C++, which is based on SQL. So it gives you a way to program or write your program in a way that can run on multiple architectures. And once you've written your application using one API, then you can use whatever framework you like. For example, if you're into artificial intelligence or AI, you can use TensorFlow, PyTorch, OpenVINO, your framework of choice, and then your application on top of it. And by doing so, there are three major benefits that you get by using one API. So if you build a slide, you will see those three are, firstly, it gives you the freedom to make your best choice. Your choice of hardware can come later, but your application, what you're trying to achieve, comes first. So it gives you more freedom. Secondly, if you build a slide, you'll see it helps you realize all the hardware value. So maybe today you think CPU is the best choice and you write your program that works really good on CPUs. 5 years later, you've realized that you want to upgrade your system with a CPU plus GPU configuration, plus you want to add an FPGA, but you don't want to have to invest too much energy backporting legacy code that was only written for CPUs. So one API will give you the flexibility to realize all the hardware value, because all you've done is now you have been able to keep advancing that same program to work on multiple architectures and add more latest hardware to your system without having to worry about too much about porting. And the last benefit is that it lets you develop and deploy software with a peace of mind. Software is a major product that a lot of us work on and deploy. And we don't want the developers who are writing these software products to have to worry about underlying hardware. So that's what one API and the idea of unified cross-architecture programming gives you, is the flexibility to develop and deploy software without having to think about the underlying hardware.
Vinesh, first, thank you for that incredible, introduction to this incredibly technical topic. If I were to summarize, or if I were to relate it back to something, and here's just a quick example that comes to mind. A lot of times people will build their own PCs, and over time they'll switch out different parts of their PC. So, maybe they want to upgrade their GPU, maybe they want to upgrade their CPU, or any other accelerator that you mentioned. So by developing software that leverages this kind of API, it doesn't matter, what different tools or what different accelerators that we're plugging in and upgrading over time. The software that, whatever software product you're using is not only flexible and can adapt to any of those different hardware components, but in addition, this API allows you to optimize. Is that kind of where you're getting at here?
Yep, that's a good summary, yes.
Okay, awesome. Just wanted to check my understanding there. Awesome. Well, let's move on to the next slide. I'd love if you would be able to share a little bit more about some examples that we're seeing today.
Yes, thanks, Sarah. And folks in the audience, this is my last slide. Our goal was not to give too many slides, but I will end my presentation by giving you an example from the healthcare field. So I'll give you a medical imaging example because that's an area that I'm more familiar with. So when you think about medical imaging, you think about modalities like CT, MRI, X-ray, PET, mammogram. And each of these medical imaging modalities had a number of compute-intensive processes, including image rendering, image reconstruction. And with artificial intelligence, or AI, becoming more normal in the world, all of these compute-intensive processes are getting augmented by AI. And this augmentation is happening either to fasten the speed of application, or to fasten the time of diagnosis so you get the results really quickly. And all of that together is driving the need of workload consolidation, where historically what used to happen is there's a compute device sitting next to, say, an MR or a CT machine, and it's dedicated to that one machine doing all the workload. Now, with consolidation happening, folks are looking at building these heterogeneous system that can run multiple applications over virtual machines. So they utilize more hardware from the same investment, and they're able to run multiple of these applications on heterogeneous systems. So maybe a normal image reconstruction is only running on CPU, then another virtual machine which needs to do an AI training and is running on a GPU, and then maybe an image rendering or image post-processing, pre-processing is running on FPGA on the same system. So you're realizing more value for your hardware and able to consolidate and run multiple applications over the same hardware. And all of those needs, whether it's compute intensity growing on, AI augmentation happening, workload consolidation happening, all of that is driving the need of common programming language, removal of hardware vendor lock-in, and a faster time to market. And that's exactly what a unified cross-architecture programming is trying to address. And one of them way of doing that is by one API.
Thanks, Beenish. I'll go ahead and I'll stop sharing. David, I'd like to toss it to you. Beenish just shared a lot of really interesting, a really interesting example within medical imaging, which I think we see throughout the care space, as well as some of the clinical research space, but you have a lot of expertise in clinical research. Do you have any examples or thoughts?
I do, but I first want to kind of highlight a couple of points that Beenish brought out, which I think is so critical in this space. And the first one is recognizing value, right? And I think we spoke about choice and flexibility. I think we're seeing advances, that are so disparate across our industry and advancements. The ability to have flexible models that allow you to very quickly and easily, whether from a software or a hardware perspective, be able to capitalize on some of that value, I think it's really, really critical. As I look at cross-architecture model, heterogeneous computing, I think about a couple of key areas. It's volume, it's velocity, and it's variety, being both drivers and barriers in delivering efficient, better clinical outcomes, and perhaps even unknown or future signal detection. So the ability of software to truly scale across diverse hardware modalities can have a significant impact on how clinical research is performed today and in the future. It really allows us to democratize the access to higher computing performance, I think increase the speed on producing insights from high volume multi-source data. We deal with problems like structured versus unstructured data, lab data, imaging, which Beenish just so eloquently showed us. But then you have payer data. We have the continuous flow of things like sensors or wearables or various patient records. I think combining all of these together is really an enabler of being able to have better interrogation to gain better insights at scale, and from a clinical standpoint, proving out clinical endpoints better and providing better safety monitoring. I think the product of all this as a practical example is, let's take oncology, for example, which we like to think of it as sort of the perfect storm in clinical research. You talk about that volume, that sheer volume of data that's available from scans, genomics, clinical data, sample analysis, and so on, to the velocity, the speed, which is so critical for diagnosis and treatment options in oncology. And then that variety. Oncology has the most sources of data that potentially come to us in clinical research: CT, MRI, PET scans, mammograms, histopaths. But then you got RNA and DNA sequencing, right down to patient input, like patient-reported outcomes that could all come to us. And then you combine it all together with what I call the noise or the side effects, comorbidities, alternate medicine, and then we have human factor. We have people involved, sick people are involved in these trials. So to have software models that unify all of these multiple different sources and allow us to interrogate and give better data insights, I think is really critical for speed and cost reductions, which are key in a clinical research space. I think that promise of enhancing the technology solutions for oncology could lead to early diagnosis or early treatments in clinical research. And ultimately, we could even see us moving from looking at a single study with single endpoints to having all the hardware modalities helping us provide a meta-analysis and aggregate all of these trials to really provide better and future insights into clinical research.
That's fascinating. I want to pick on one thing that you mentioned, right? Like at the end of the day, we all want our diagnosis and our intervention to be faster. We want it to be more cost effective for both patients as well as providers, caregivers. I think all of the stakeholders throughout clinical research and care have skin in the game here. I'd love to dive deeper. How does heterogeneous computing and how does leveraging a unified cross-architecture programming API do that for us?
Do you want me to take that, or do you want Binish to take that one first?
You can go ahead, David.
Oh, okay. I'm going to give an example of that. I think above what we've discussed before, there's a couple of areas. We're certainly seeing AI and ML would be probably a key area where we could use this advanced technology, enhanced technology, to reduce time and therefore, in a lot of cases, cost. I think AI and ML has a broad range of applicability in clinical research and development, and even today, that includes kind of identifying modules that have molecules that have the most potential, to finding patient population that fit inclusion and exclusion criteria, a real struggle for us in clinical research as well. And they could also be used for reviewing some of the data, scans, claims reports, mass data, healthcare data, to interpret all this information, build out trends, and improve and accelerate decision-making for us. I think a second dimension that we could look at as well is, how do you use heterogeneous computing and a cross-architecture software model to expand the aperture of the hardware modalities available in clinical research? Maybe an example of that is perhaps multimodal sensor data, the ability to monitor and interrogate this consistent flow of masses of data from different modalities in real time to derive those meaningful and actionable insights. That holds a lot of promise for clinicians and drug developers. So we can look at things like pulse oximetry, spirometry, blood pressure, which are sensors available today and are starting to move more and more into clinical research as real-world, real-time mass data collection from our patients. But I think if you open that aperture a little bit further, you could say, could I use this type of model efficiently to analyze things like environmental factors that may have an impact on the patient and the actual clinical data that's being collected? So have a broader cross-referenced view into all of the data that is being collected as well. Binish, perhaps over to you from there.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. I love it because David is giving perspective more from the end user's perspective on from clinical research example. So I'll just add on to what David has said and give more from the middle layer from deployment perspective. So Sarah, you mentioned that we have to think about both the patient and the provider. And at the end of the day, what I feel is, as one of being a patient or being somebody who uses hospital network, I would think like, what do I care about? I want my results faster and I want it at an affordable cost. Those are my two governing factors. And both the provider and the hospital infrastructure and patient are driving towards those end goals, that I want to get to things faster and I want to get it at an affordable cost. And that's what I think heterogeneous computing with unified programming gives the capability is folks in the provider who are actually building these or investing in these infrastructures to get results faster, results from what David mentioned, from a variety of multimodal data. It could be electronic health record, it could be medical imaging data, it could be lab and life science data, it could be clinical research data, it could be even like sensor patient monitoring data, all of these data feeding into some compute infrastructure that exists within the hospital infrastructure, or it exists in the cloud. And when you're feeding all this data and you want to process all of this faster, you want to make sure you have a system that can process this faster, but then all of these different kinds of data might get processed differently. For example, if it's a vision, say a camera feed coming in from some hospital room, then that might work really good on a vision processing unit or a VPU. If there is an electronic health record where you want to add in AI for natural language processing, that might work really good on a CPU. So all of these data might need different kind of hardware. And that's what we are trying to do, is consolidate all the hardware in a heterogeneous system, which has a main central compute, but then different accelerators that can take in these data, process it faster, and give the results what patient needs quickly. But at the same time, you're investing in one consolidated heterogeneous system that will definitely reduce the cost from the provider's perspective. And then, of course, there is software, which is very important, because building this heterogeneous system is not enough if you cannot write applications to fully utilize this deployment. And that's why unified programming will help you do, is like, even though there are different hardwares within this heterogeneous system, your application developers are using a common programming language to fully utilize the investment that you're making in these heterogeneous system. So that's how I see that both payer and provider would benefit from a heterogeneous system using a common programming language.
Awesome. Yeah, it almost seems like a no-brainer. Like, if, we relate it back to people, like if you have someone that's really good at developing code versus someone that's really good at being a scrum master, maybe, why would you swap places? Why would you not just optimize? And if you know that one person's really good at developing, give them all of the problems in the world to develop. If you know that someone's really good at, managing a backlog and driving progress and efficiency, why would you not give them that task? It's the same thing, but we're talking about hardware here. I think that's fascinating. I'm curious, what do you, I guess, Binish and David both, what do you see as the current challenges in deploying this type of architecture? Like, why wouldn't everyone do this right away?
Yeah, a good question. And I can start here. So one of the biggest challenges that we see is just historical and legacy porting. Healthcare, as everybody knows, it moves at a much slower pace for a variety of reasons, including regulatory restrictions that we have. But there's also, like, if something is working and your patient is getting treated, you don't want to change that. Why would you want to change something if it's working successfully? So it's a bit difficult to get over that bump of, like, this is how it's always worked, and this is why you should change. So I think changing mental perspective of the ecosystem is one challenge. Secondly, there's a lot of legacy work in application and software that's existing, and just investing resources. So you have to balance out resource and next generation innovation, or investing the same resources in porting your legacy work. So I think that is a balance that the infrastructure team has to figure out, is how do we balance resources? Because maybe your current deployment is a dedicated deployment running on a specific hardware. Now you want to upgrade it. What would it cost to upgrade it, but also port all the applications to a heterogeneous system? So I think that's also a major reason that's limiting the adoption. But I feel like as more people adopt it, as more folks see the value in it, the adoption rate will increase. And definitely, I would love to hear how David sees it more from the clinical research perspective, how the challenges and how we can change this.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna before I talk a little bit about the challenges, I'm gonna just tap back into one of the benefits, and you got me thinking about it as you were talking about it. I think this type of model allows us to rethink the specificity of software development across unique and disparate modalities. Essentially, this approach holds the promise of allowing us to expand our planning for the future of software coding. Build today, use tomorrow. I think it's certainly got an opportunity there. I think on top of that, could software libraries not be as hardware specific as they have to be today, and really start to go and have a cost driver? But if I think of some of the challenges, and Binish highlighted them very well, historically regulatory acceptance, whether that's real or perceived, newer, different approaches have been traditionally slow in health sciences and the clinical space. I think to some extent we saw this change, but with COVID, it certainly was from like direct source data. COVID was definitely a catalyst. We saw a peak. We've seen that start to level off and normalize, and some of our drug developers starting to revert back to some of the traditional ways that they were able to, or they were comfortable doing studies before. But our regulators certainly have adopted some of these new and key capabilities that we bring in together. I think when you talk about a challenge, one of the impacts of this catalyzation that COVID brought us is that our end users, and in my case, drug developers and sponsors, have a higher expectation of what hardware and software bring to the table. That promise of it can save time, it can save money, I can diversify my patient population, I can reduce attrition, all of these promises that we bring forward. I think the industry is saying, well, show me now. You've had a few years of COVID. We've looked at all of these things. We were able to keep our studies running, but I'm not truly seeing some of that value. So I think as you look at these types of models, there's that hesitancy sometimes to adopt new approaches and investments in this case until we've seen some proved out of data. I think from a clinical space, the technology still needs to answer the questions around auditability, patient data privacy, and I think those are going to be critical things that we need to have an eye on as we consider looking at adopting some of this type of technology. But I think on a positive side, if you think about it, it really accelerates that ability for innovation to be implemented. There are just so many things that we can do. And if you look at this type of model, which is less specific and more broad, it really is an enabler of innovation at scale, I think.
Awesome. A gentle reminder for folks in the audience, if you do have questions, we'd welcome you to raise your hand or enter your questions in the Q&A or the chat. But I did want to build off of something that both of you mentioned, right? There's this lack of, legacy systems, or, when you're thinking about building a business case for something like this, when we look to see what have we done prior? What's been the precedent within this space? It's hard to really define that at this point, but I'm sure that this is something that other industries have seen, right? I'm curious, how has this technology and this architecture played a role within the development of other industries as well?
That's a nice question. I'm trying to think about of an industry example to give, but it could be any industry if I think of, and one of the really easy ones is to think about entertainment. The way folks use entertainment, view entertainment has changed significantly over the last 10-15 years. Whether it's being just how many providers are there from Netflix, Hulu, Amazon, everybody has a channel to provide you some kind of entertainment. Then the way the entertainment is getting consumed is through your phone, through a tablet, through laptops, through television. So I feel like the entertainment industry is also a great example where these things are have changed and could be looked into, because when you think about we as the end user of the entertainment, what do we want? We again want the same thing. We want our whatever we are watching to load really quickly, so time is of essence, and we don't want to pay too much money for it. It's exactly the same thing. We want to reduce the cost. So that's what end users want. So the provider, whoever is developing the technology, building the infrastructure, writing the application that gives us the entertainment, has to again think about the same thing, latency. We want to make sure the data gets processed really quickly, gets to the end user faster, and it comes at a affordable cost. So I feel like the same concept of heterogeneous computing in entertainment, mostly though, it will be a lot of cloud-based instead of where, if you think about healthcare, it could be cloud or it could be on-prem within the hospital infrastructure deployment because of privacy reasons. So the deployment model might be slightly different in the two cases. And in entertainment, it would likely going to be a lot cloud-based, but it's still the same concept, is like building these heterogeneous system, irrespective of what cloud service provider you're thinking of. You can go find the right system with the right compute as well as the right accelerators, write your program in one thing so that next time when the cloud service provider upgrades to a completely different accelerator, you can just upgrade it and upgrade the end user's experience without having the application developer to go change it. So, I mean, I gave an example from entertainment, but I'm sure exactly same thing applies to retail, banking, hospitality, because at the end, we as humans, we always want things to come faster at a good quality, but at a acceptable cost. So I think that end user's expectation is what's driving how the infrastructure deployment and application development is done by the folks who are working on it.
Yeah, Binish, maybe to add to that, I think automation is something that we look for as well, right? We want it cheaper, we want it quicker, but I think we want automation, and stepping out on a limb here a little bit, think of where our automotive industry is moving to today, right? With automated car driving, right? It's whether it's lane assist, radar, GPS, traffic, people, velocity, all of these different types of modalities of data coming in and influences, environmental influences, and our ability for these cars to actually be able to automate it. I see that probably as an area where they are, at least from a model and concept perspective, are using similar types of concepts.
Yep. And I love that David mentioned that, Sarah, because I think that is the next generation. David gave an example from automotive industry, because again, it's the idea that David had mentioned earlier, like different sensors feeding in all kinds of data that the compute has to process really quickly. And the same is happening in healthcare with different data sets, whether it's clinical data, lab and life sciences data, computer vision data, electronic health record, text data. It's all like these different multimodal data sets coming together that needs to be processed really faster. And again, I think that will also drive a lot of innovation and how the adoption of this technology happens in the next few years.
Yeah, drive innovation. I see what you did there, Binish. No, I really like the automobile industry, because I think about you own a car, like you have to go, and sometimes you need to get parts replaced. Sometimes your light stops working, or you need to replace something in your brakes, and to be able to start updating those modules or those components, boom, there's a heterogeneous system, right? And you're dealing with different hardware that, if your car is leveraging software or an operating system that can manage, all of these different pieces and parts, right? Like that's, at the end of the day, like ensuring your safety as a driver. Or if we're talking about the healthcare industry, ensuring that no matter what hardware pieces you're putting together, that your software can run, you can get those real-time data insights. You can get information, the right information when you need it in order to make decisions, whether it's, clinical decision-making, if it's safety monitoring. David, I know that that's something that you brought up before. Or anything of that nature.
I think there as well, from a clinical perspective, being a little bit more predictive and prescriptive, how can this technology ultimately play into how do we identify molecules that might have potential for given therapeutic areas, even prior to a clinical study being done. Patient identification, I think, is always critical for us. Better inclusion, exclusion criteria, patient populations, and I think you talked about identifying safety trends or adverse events. Having access to a broader subset of data, I think, it could help us in identifying some of those adverse or potential serious adverse events, but ultimately helping us improve decision making earlier on in drug development. Of course, it's all predicated on being able to get large sets of data, disparate types of data, consolidate and consume and interrogate them in using technology in the smartest possible way.
Absolutely. And I know I've heard rumblings across the field, you hear about all of these different organizations that are developing measures that they're pulling one thing from an accelerometer, another thing from imaging, another thing from, you know, you name it. There are so many different wearables and sensors out there at this point that if we had access to process all of that data and be able to come up with some of those actionable insights, I think that the sky's the limit when it comes to measure development, which is something that we do quite a bit here at Dime. I'm curious, where do we go from here? You know, what does the future of heterogeneous computing look like? And how do we take it to that next level in terms of, you know, acceptance, adoption? Where do we go from here?
David,
I'm
you want to start?
going to let you go on that one. I think this is very much your area of expertise.
So the future, as I've mentioned, I might be just repeating myself, is the future is the heterogeneous system. They will likely end up being only a selected number of accelerators that might be combined. So from hardware perspective, that's what I see is happening, is that the hardware accelerator types might be getting combined into one system by itself. Also, the type of accelerators might be increasing, because at this point AI is causing a lot of innovation to happen, and a lot of folks are trying out different ways to really speed up the AI inferencing and training applications. I think that's driving a lot of companies investing money in figuring out what is that right hardware architecture that works best for a variety of AI deployments. So I think there'll be a future for me from hardware perspective also looks like is people will do a lot of trial and error until they find that one solution that works for most. And that could be another set of hardware accelerator that could be added to this heterogeneous architecture. So that's from hardware perspective. But then from software side, what I see is more folks are seeing the software first approach, which is what's causing the idea of unified programming also, is that more and more applications are being software driven. Going back to the example David gave on automobiles, is if you see the next generation of cars are almost software run. They come with certain hardware, but if tomorrow you want to upgrade to have a better lane departure, the software will upgrade in your system. You don't really have to do anything with the hardware. All you need is software. So everything is being driven by software. There's a whole model on how do we monetize more on software. So I feel like there's a trend in industry to figure out really to better provide better service to the end user by developing or innovating on the software side. And at the heart of software are the developers who actually develop these applications. And that's why we want, the idea is to make that development of software easier for those developers by providing them a programming language that they don't have to think about the underlying hardware, and that can be easily portable. And whenever the next generation of hardware comes up, they can still port it. So I think that's where I see the industry going, is more adoption of the unification of not just the hardware, unification of the way the programs are written for these hardware, but also a lot of innovation happening on the software side in healthcare specifically, so that the end user, the end consumer can get the benefit of these innovations. So those are some things I see. Looking forward to hear what David thinks.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a great perspective of where we're going. I think it's to that point, right, as mentioned earlier, rethinking the specificity of software development, right? So building for today for what the future could be, whether that's a concept around more generic software toolkits that are less dependent on the hardware architectures and modalities. And being able to truly start to unlock some of the value that you can gain from that. I think that's probably where I would see this moving to. Back to from a clinical perspective, more data is better data as long as you are able to automate the interrogation of that. You know, today you get your blood pressure taken once a week when you go to the doctor in a clinical study. Can we do that 10 times a day? Are there triggers that we could look at to say we need to take the blood pressure now? I think ability to use all of that, less from a clinical research, but more from a healthcare perspective. So start really using software and technology as an arm of clinical treatment, I think is where we could see this grow and expand.
Definitely focusing on innovation of software and really within innovation within software, focusing on the evidence and the insights that we can derive from the software that we're putting into play. One last question, then I promise I'll give a little bit of space for folks on the line to ask their questions. But what does this mean from an access perspective? I'm curious. This kind of hardware architecture, I mean, my mind jumps to, it makes it easier to not have to worry about your software and the software that you're purchasing and putting into place. If I'm a hospital system, for example, I don't have to think as much about a software upgrade or upgrading my hardware. Like if I want to start getting different components and putting those into play within, you know, my tech stack at a hospital. What are your thoughts on, you know, does this help improve access to technologies? Does it help improve access or scalability for organizations that are smaller maybe, or have fewer resources that they're able to drive toward innovation?
So my perspective on that would be, it's an interesting question because the word access, I was thinking, could be interpreted in a lot of ways. So I definitely think that access to scalability will definitely increase, because now if you're a limited resource company, you can just focus on developing the application, the software application you're developing, without having to go buy the hardware first, then figure out what programming language to use, and then develop your application based on that programming language. This way you start with the application, and then you're like, okay, this application runs whether I buy this kind of hardware, that kind of hardware, or provide it through a cloud service provider, it should work. So I think access to scalability, especially for smaller companies, would increase with this kind of deployment. What I was also thinking is access to just meaningful insight to your own data will increase, because we know that technologies is improving. Different like number of devices just providing different kinds of data is just constantly increasing. Even like a smart watch is providing more and more information to different kinds of data set now. So we know that the data would be just keep on increasing, but the data, as David mentioned, is not meaningful unless we can integrate it. And if we integrate it, then we also need to derive meaningful insight. So my belief is like the idea of unified programming to get access to more insight is also that unified programming with heterogeneous architecture will provide to the users.
Yeah, not a lot to add to that. I think it's the points that we make, right? Access to more data, interrogated to derive more and quicker insights, I think is really what I would say from an access perspective.
Yeah, scalability and capabilities.
Yep, flexibility, scalability, yep.
Awesome. I'll pause. Are there any questions from folks who are on the line? Feel free to put them in the chat, in the Q&A, or raise your hand. I know it's a lot of information to process. And maybe while folks are thinking about some of the questions that they might have, I'll go ahead and I'll share my screen again, because there are, oh, I don't know that this was the, yeah, a couple of resources for you to get started. If you know what we discussed today is of interest, if you're a digital health product team and you're looking to maybe start leveraging some of this technology in your software development, couple of resources that Bunish has kindly provided in order to help folks get started. You can scan the QR codes there. In addition, we'd welcome you all to stay connected with our panelists on LinkedIn or in other various forums. And I could have sworn I had a version of this slide that had QR codes with the LinkedIn, profiles as well, but it seems that somehow I had gotten an outdated version of this slide, so apologies. Any other questions? Great. If not, again, please feel free to reach out to us after this. David Blackman, Venus Diaz, Sarah Valentine. We'd love to stay connected on LinkedIn and definitely stay tuned for more. I know, both of these, Venus and David, are both excellent subject matter experts. We're so thrilled that we could have them on the line today, and they're constantly, providing their insights and their perspectives across the field, whether it's through different blog posts, through different conferences and panels and things of that nature. So definitely stay engaged there. In addition, for those of you who are interested in staying in the loop with anything DIME related, we do have a couple of upcoming events that I'd love to share with you all. Our upcoming virtual journal club is going to be a fantastic discussion on the applicability of AI in healthcare in resource poor settings. So you can kind of see where I was maybe trying to lay tracks there toward the end as a segue. But I think that this will be an excellent discussion around how AI, not only does it allow us to innovate, but how can it be applied in places that do have relatively fewer resources and that type of thing. So be sure to join us. It's next week. We'd love to see you there. And then in addition, we also do have an upcoming webinar for our diversity, equity, and inclusion in digitized clinical trials project. And so DIME projects generally, what we're best at, our superpower in the field, is to convene folks that are playing within this space across the field, variety of perspectives and that kind of thing. And in this case, our end goal was really to move the needle on, we hear a lot about diversity, but what can we actually do to solve it? And what can we actually do to make meaningful progress within this space? And so you can see the variety of folks that we'll have joining us for that session. Please do join us. It will be in a couple weeks now, Wednesday, February 15th. So be sure to sign up afterward. And then let's see if I have any other slides, our notices and disclaimers. But with that, thank you to everyone who is able to join us today. Any last questions before we close here? I'll go back to the QR codes. Excellent. All right. Well, thank you, Bunish and David. Really appreciated hearing your expertise within the space and really the opportunity to learn from you. It's been such a pleasure, and I really appreciate all that you were able to educate us on today, but then also, tying it back to the work that we all are doing across this field. So thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day. Appreciate
Thanks, Sarah.
it.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.